Hi guys, this is chapter 32 of Adam Brinkley American History, and this is the last chapter that we have, so let's get going. So we're going to start out with Clinton's presidency. He entered into office with a very ambitious domestic agenda, but the Democratic strongholds in Congress were weak, and Republican leadership in Congress was not used to bowing down to presidential orders. After a long history of having Republican presidents, Republicans were not super keen on bowing down. Clinton had a tumultuous start. He made efforts to end the ban on gay men and women in the military and faced massive resistance from both parties. Several of his appointments to office were so controversial he had to withdraw them, and Vince Foster's suicide sparked inquiry into some banking and real estate ventures involving Clinton and his wife. This is known as a Whitewater affair, and an independent counsel began to examine these issues. He won approval of a budget that marked a turn away from the policies of Reagan-Bush years. It was a tax increase on wealthy Americans, reduction in government spending, and expansion of tax credits to low-income working people. He advocated free trade, and he won the approval for NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which eliminated trade barriers among U.S., Canada, and Mexico. He won approval for the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, otherwise known as GATT, and it was a far-reaching trade agreement. He tried to reform the nation's healthcare system, and he appointed a task force chaired by Hillary Clinton, which proposed a sweeping reform designed to guarantee coverage to every American and hold down the cost of medical care. And their fierce opposition in Congress abandoned the healthcare reform effort. Initially, Clinton was cautious and tentative in foreign policy, and Bosnia was embroiled in a bloody civil war between its two major ethnic groups, one Muslim and the other Serbian and Christian, and the American negotiator Richard Holbrooke finally brought the warring parties together and crafted an agreement to partition Bosnia. So early failures damaged the Democratic Party as it led to the election of 1994, and Republicans gained control of both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years. The Republican Congress worked to construct an ambitious and even radical legislative program. They proposed a series of measures to transfer important powers from the federal government to the states. They proposed dramatic reductions in federal spending, including restructuring of the Medicare program. They attempted to scale back a wide range of federal regulatory functions. And Clinton responded to the 1994 election by claiming that the era of big government is over, and shifting his agenda to the center, and announced a plan to cut taxes and balance the budget. Compromise between Clinton and Congress was difficult, and a government shutdown for several days because the president and Congress could not agree on a budget agreement. Republican leaders had refused to pass a continuing resolution to allow the government operations to continue during negotiations in hopes of pressuring the president to agree to their terms. And this failed because public opinion turned against the Republican leadership because they didn't think that they handled that very well. House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who was a Republican, became discredited, and Clinton improved his standing in the polls. And the election of 1996, Clinton was unopposed for Democratic nomination and faced Senator Robert Dole from Kansas. Clinton ran on the success of the American economy and marked reduction in federal deficit, and Congress passed bills raising minimum wage, a welfare reform, which ended the 50-year federal guarantee of assistance to families with dependent children, and turned the responsibility for allocating federal welfare funds to the states. Clinton won with 49% of the popular vote, and Dole had 41%. Republicans still remained in control of both houses of Congress, and Clinton was the first Democratic president to win 2 terms since FDR. So, moving on to Clinton's second term, he proposed a modest domestic agenda consisting of tax cuts and tax credits targeted at middle-class Americans to help them educate their children. He negotiated efficiently with Republicans on a plan for a balanced budget. And during this time, Paula Jones, who was a colleague when he was in office in Arkansas, she filed a lawsuit for sexual harassment during his first weeks during his second term. Also, the Monica Lewinsky scandal and impeachment from lying under oath and obstructing justice happened during this term. He was acquitted pretty decisively, and actually his rating went up after this. Foreign policy problems during the second term In the Balkans, there was a civil war between Yugoslavia and Kosovo, and NATO began a bombing campaign against the Serbians. And shortly after this started, the leader of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, agreed to a ceasefire, and he finished his 8 years in office with his popularity higher than it had been when he had taken office. Moving on to the election of 2000, okay, this was kind of a wild election. It was George W. Bush, who was the Republican governor of Texas and son of former President George H.W. Bush, versus Al Gore as a Democrat, and Al Gore was the vice president for Clinton. Republicans maintained control of the House and Senate, and the Senate was split even. Sorry, Hillary Clinton was one of the winners during this campaign. So during the presidential election, Gore won popular vote by 540,000 votes, but both candidates were short of the 270 electoral votes because no one could determine the winner of Florida. A recount revealed that Bush led Gore by fewer than 300 votes in Florida, and Bush was declared the winner, and Gore contested the results. And the Bush campaign appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court decided that they must have the recount completed by December 12th, or the Bush victory stood, and this was completely impossible for the recount to happen as quickly as they requested it to do, and this decision was made based on party lines in the Supreme Court. So it's pretty controversial, but Bush was named president. So during Bush's presidency, he passed the largest tax cut in American history. He governed as a staunch conservative, and his political advisor, Karl Rove, encouraged the administration to take increasingly conservative positions. He refused to renew the assault weapons ban that Clinton had enacted in the country, and he proposed a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage. And the aftermath of 9/11 dominated his presidency and the nation's policies. And the election of 2004 was Bush v. John Kerry, and Bush won with 51% of the popular vote. So moving on to economic booms and downturns, many American corporations began making important changes in the way they ran their business. They invested heavily in new technology. They considered mergers to provide themselves with a more diversified basis for growth. Enterprises created more energy-efficient plants and offices, and they sought to reduce their labor costs. They did this by taking a harder line against unions. They also moved operations to areas of the country where unions were weak and wages were low, and they also moved production out of the U.S. Growth of technological industries grew the economy. Digital technology was new, computers, internet, cell phones, digital media, video, cameras, all of it was new, and all created new jobs, so it helped spur the economy. The gross national product, which is GNP, quadrupled in 20 years. Inflation was low. There was economic downturns during this time. Alan Greensburg, was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and there was a sudden and disastrous collapse of the booming new dot-com sector of the economy, and it recovered slowly in 2002. Poverty declined, but it did not persist, it did not keep going, and globalization began to make more of an impact, which is basically the shrinking of the world because of connections with technology and faster traveling. So it's cultures and customs and trends get to other people quicker. So science and new technology in this time. The microprocessor, which was first introduced by the Intel, miniaturized the central processing unit of a computer, making it possible for a small machine to perform calculations that in the past only very large machines could do. In 1977, Apple launched its Apple II personal computer, the first such machine to be widely available to the public, and IBM entered the personal computer market with the first PC. IBM engaged Microsoft to design an operating system for the new computer, and Microsoft introduced a program known as MS-DPS, and no PC could operate without it. Apple's Macintosh computer marked another major innovation in computer technology. It was easier to use than the PC, but Apple struggled to match IBM and Microsoft's marketing power. This technology boom created a new lucrative business. The internet allowed people to connect to the network and to communicate with others all over the world. And beginning in 1963, the U.S. government's Advanced Research Project Agency, which funneled funds into scientific research projects, many defense related, that started to research computer and such stuff. J.C.R. Licklider, the header of ARPA's Processing Technique Office was working on a project he called the Libraries of the Future, through which he hoped to make vast amounts of information available electronically to people in far-flung areas. He launched a program to link together computers all over the large distances known as ARPANET. Technologies helped the expansion of the internet. They could store and forward packet switching, which made possible the transmission of large quantities of data between computers without directly wiring the computers together. This was developed at the RAND Corporation in the United States and the National Physical Lab in England. And the interface message processor allowed individual computers to handle the traffic all over the network. And Tim Berners-Lee introduced the World Wide Web, through which individuals could publish information for the internet. So also during this time, there were genetic breakthroughs, and early discoveries in genetics were made by Gregor Mendel, and Thomas Hunt Morgan and others laid the groundwork for more dramatic breakthroughs. The discovery of DNA by Oswald Avery, Colin MacLeod, and Macklin McCarty revolutionized genetic studies. And the discovery of DNA's double helix structure was founded by James Watson and Francis Crick, and this led to genetic engineering. Humans began to identify specific genes in humans and learned how to alter or reproduce them. And the National Center on Human Genome was funded by the government, and they gave $3 billion to study genetics. Also during this time, the American population grew larger and older and more racially and ethnically diverse. Birth rates decreased and lifespans increased. Growing population of aging Americans contributed stresses in Social Security and Medicare systems. Immigration grew in this time, as well as the number of foreign-born residents of the U.S., and that was the highest in American history. And the 1965 Immigration Reform Act eliminated national origins as a criteria, and that increased more international immigrants. And Latinos and Asians were by far the largest groups of immigrants in these years, and others came in significant numbers from Africa, Middle East, Russia, and Eastern Europe. The Civil Rights Movement had two different effects on African Americans. One was increased opportunities for advancement to those in a position to take advantage, but many were barred from upward mobility. During the first decade of the 21st century, economic and social disparities between races diminished. The underclass blacks did not receive the same benefits that middle and upper class blacks did, and they lived in isolated, decaying, and poor inner city neighborhoods. There was a dramatic increase of drug use beginning in the 1980s, and this was a large demand for cocaine. Drugs use declined in the middle class in the late 80s, but declined very slowly in poor urban areas. And this is when people started to see AIDS. And this is transmitted by exchange of bodily fluids, and it destroys the body's immune system and makes the victims highly vulnerable to a number of diseases to which they would otherwise have a natural resistance. And the U.S. government and other countries committed significant funds to fight the AIDS crisis in Africa and all over the world. Moving on to feminism and abortion battles. The goal of the new right was to challenge feminism and its achievements. They campaigned successfully against the proposed Equal Rights Amendment, and they also played a central role over abortion rights. So Roe v. Wade legalized abortion, and this was supported by pro-choice members and very disliked by pro-life people. This started the Right to Life movement, and supporters were among Catholic, Mormons, and evangelical Christians. Congress and many state legislators began barring the use of public funds to pay for abortions, making it inaccessible for many poor women. Reagan and Bush administration opposed further restrictions on federal funding and even on the right of doctors in federally funded clinics to give parties any information on abortions. Right to Life people also began picketing, occupying, and bombing abortion clinics and murdering doctors who performed abortions. The pro-choice movement defended the woman's rights to choose when to bear a child. So, moving on to environmentalism and globalism. Environmentalists blocked the construction of roads, airports, and other projects that they claimed would be ecologically dangerous, and taking advantage of new legislation protecting endangered species and environmentally fragile regions. They began to mobilize around global warming, which is a rise in the Earth's temperature as a result from the burning of fossil fuels. The Kyoto Agreement was a broad treaty establishing steps towards reducing carbon emissions and thus slowing or reversing global warming. Opposition to treaty from Republicans in Congress prevented Clinton from winning ratification, and Bush announced the treaty. And China did not ratify either, so many people consider this treaty dead. There was a large opposition to globalization, and Americans both on the left and right opposed the nation's increasingly interventionist foreign policy. Critics charged that the U.S. was using military action to advance its economic interests, especially in the Gulf War and Iraq War. Many groups saw it as an economic threat. Labor unions insisted that the rapid expansion of free trade led to exports of jobs. Groups attacking working conditions in new manufacturing countries and argued that global economy was creating a new classes of slave laborers. Environmentalists argued that globalization exported industrial pollution and toxic waste into nations without laws to govern against it. Multinational institutions that policed and advanced the global economy were organizations such as the World Trade Organization, which monitored the enforcement of GATT treaties, the International Monetary Fund, which controlled international credit and exchange rates, the World Bank, which made money available for development projects in many countries, and there were protests in Seattle at the IMF and World Bank, and there was a meeting in Genoa, Italy, to respond to these protests, and they pledged $1.2 billion to fight AIDS. So, the Iranian Revolution, in which Orthodox Muslims ousted a despotic government whose leaders has embraced many aspects of modern Western culture. Waves of fundamentalist orthodoxy emerged to defend traditional culture against incursions from the West. There was a growing resort to violence as a way to fight the influence of the West. 9/11, there was a bombing in the Marine barracks in 1983, a bombing in the parking garage of the World Trade Center, and car bombing in Oklahoma City. And the aftermath of 9/11, the U.S. launched a war against terrorism. Attacks on 9/11 connected to Al Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden, and the Taliban was a militant group. The U.S. began a campaign of bombing against the regime and sending groups to help a resistance organization to overthrow the Afghan government. The Patriot Act of 2001 made it possible for suspected terrorists to be held for months without access to lawyers, without facing formal charges, subjected to intensive interrogation and torture. Several Supreme Court rulings dismissed the Bush administration's argument that detainees in Guantanamo were outside the reach of American law. Administration was slow to comply, however. Bush claimed that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were an axis of evil, which are nations with anti-American regimes possessing nuclear weapons. The Bush administration built a public case for invading Iraq resting on the fact that they were supporting terrorist groups and they were developing weapons of mass destruction. And American and British troops invaded Iraq and toppled the Hussein regime. So Bush passed a No Child Left Behind bill, and this tied federal funding in schools to the success of students in taking standardized tests. Bush found himself unable to make progress in any significant legislation. The election of 2004, Bush v. John Kerry, and Bush won in a narrow victory. Bush's second term was difficult. There was the war of Iraq, government response to Katrina, which was incompetent and not a good response at all, and scandals in the Justice Department, revelations of illegal violations of civil liberties, declining economic prospects, and the election of 2008, John McCain from Arizona versus Barack Obama, a senator from Illinois. McCain supported Iraq. Obama proposed reduction of troops. McCain opposed national health insurance. Obama supported it. McCain supported additional tax cuts. Obama urged tax increases. Obama chose Biden as his running mate, and McCain chose Sarah Palin. And this did a lot of damage to his campaign because she seemed inexperienced. There were financial problems in mid-2007, which altered the outcome of the election, and Obama won with 53% of the popular vote, and Congress made substantial Democratic gains. So Obama's presidency, he proposed a stimulus package to respond to the economic crisis, and this contributed to shoring up state budgets, creating jobs, and launching important improvements to schools, scientific research, and infrastructure. His most important thing he did was the passage of universal health care, which was expensive. It narrowly passed in Congress, and it was opposed by the right because they called it a government takeover. He also brought an end to the war in Iraq, but right after that, he committed troops to war in Afghanistan. He appointed Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State, and she sought to create peace between Israel and Palestine, improve relations with many nations that the Iraq War had damaged, and to build new international trade opportunities. He visited China and South Korea, hoping to reach a progress on trade, but they failed to reach an agreement. The Tea Party movement, formed by dissident Americans, which rallied around such issues such as deficit reduction, tax reduction, and smaller government. In 2010 midterm, Democrats lost 6 seats in the Senate and 64 seats in the House of Representatives, and Obama responded for calling for bipartisanship. And that is the end of the chapter, the end of APUSH quizzes, and the end. So, yay, thanks for watching, and we made it!